Our story begins in Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia, a city known for its conservative values and rigorous legal framework. In this society, where the moral compass is deeply intertwined with religious teachings, relationships and family honor hold a critical place. This tale starts with a shocking discovery that would shatter a family and lead to consequences none could have foreseen. One afternoon, an ordinary husband, Omar, came across a disturbing piece of information that shook his trust to the core. Through whispers in the neighborhood and an anonymous tip from a neighbor, Omar learned that his wife, Fatima, had been seen visiting a man's house under questionable circumstances. Struggling to believe it at first, Omar's world began to unravel. Instead of confronting Fatima directly, he chose to hide his hurt and anger, meticulously plotting a way to uncover the truth and punish her betrayal. What followed was a journey of deception, secrecy, and vengeance that would change their lives forever. Fatima was born in Riyadh into a loving, middle-class Muslim family. Growing up in a society governed by strict rules of conduct, she was taught to be respectful, observant, and uphold the family's honor above all else. From a young age, Fatima's life was shaped by Islamic values and the teachings of her family. She learned to cherish these values and dreamed of a life that would fulfill her family's expectations. As a young woman, Fatima was known for her beauty, grace, and kindness. Her parents shielded her from unnecessary exposure to the world, limiting her interactions with men and discouraging any relationships outside of marriage. She spent her days helping her family, adhering to her prayers, and studying. While her world was small, Fatima found solace in her faith and her close-knit family. When she reached marriageable age, her family introduced her to Omar, a man who shared their values and aspirations for a stable, honorable family life. Although she didn't know him well, she trusted her family's judgment and believed that love and companionship would naturally develop in their marriage. With dreams of a fulfilling and supportive partnership, Fatima entered into married life with a hopeful heart. Omar was the archetype of a devout, hardworking Muslim man. He had spent years building a reputable career in the oil industry in Saudi Arabia, rising through the ranks thanks to his discipline, resilience, and dedication to his family. Omar was well regarded by his peers and seen as an honorable man by his community, a model of respectability and responsibility. From the outset, Omar's expectations for marriage were clear-cut. He sought a wife who would be loyal, supportive, and prioritize family above all else. His upbringing instilled in him a strong sense of duty to provide for his household and to uphold family honor, a value he took seriously. Though he genuinely cared for Fatima and wanted a stable life with her, his traditional views often limited his ability to see beyond his role as a provider. For Omar, love was something unspoken, best shown through actions rather than words. He assumed Fatima would understand this and be content with a life built around respect and stability. However, Omar's commitment to his work meant he was frequently absent, both physically and emotionally. His long hours and frequent business trips left Fatima alone more often than not. Omar, who believed that his success and dedication were enough, didn't grasp that his wife craved his companionship and emotional support. The gulf between them grew gradually, unnoticed by Omar, who thought he was fulfilling his role as a husband by providing financial security. Little did he know that his neglect was creating a dangerous void in their marriage, one that would ultimately drive Fatima to seek comfort elsewhere. As time passed, the cracks in Omar and Fatima's marriage began to widen. Fatima, initially hopeful and devoted to making her marriage work, felt increasingly isolated and unheard. She had dreams of a marriage filled with warmth, companionship, and shared moments of joy. Yet her life had become a quiet prison, where she waited alone day after day, hoping for attention and connection that never came. Omar's absences took a toll on her, making her feel like a forgotten part of his life. She tried to express her feelings, to hint at her need for companionship, but each attempt was met with either silence or reassurances that he was working for their future. As a result, she began to internalize her loneliness, feeling trapped and suffocated by her unfulfilled emotional needs. Friends and family provided little comfort, as her conservative upbringing left her with few confidants outside her marriage. Fatima felt that talking about her loneliness would not only be frowned upon, but would bring shame to her family. By 2018, she was caught in a cycle of desolation, waiting for a husband who was barely present in her life. The bond that might have anchored their marriage had frayed to a thread. Her loneliness and frustration grew into a deep longing for connection, understanding, and kindness. This unmet need for affection left her vulnerable and open to attention from anyone who could offer her the emotional connection she so desperately craved. In the midst of her emotional isolation, Fatima encountered Salim, a man who brought a glimmer of brightness to her otherwise bleak days. Salim was a neighbor she had seen occasionally but never interacted with beyond polite greetings. He was kind, attentive, and possessed a warmth that instantly made Fatima feel comfortable. He was close to her age, with a gentle demeanor that contrasted sharply with Omar's seriousness. Their first meaningful encounter occurred by chance at a neighborhood gathering. Salim noticed Fatima standing alone and struck up a conversation, initially discussing mundane topics like the weather and community events. But Fatima found herself sharing more than she intended, revealing glimpses of her lonely life and unfulfilled dreams. Salim listened intently, showing an interest that Fatima had longed for. Over the following weeks, they crossed paths more frequently. Salim began offering small gestures of kindness, helping her with groceries, walking her to her door, and occasionally sending her friendly messages that brightened her day. Fatima felt a growing attachment to him, a sense of ease that she hadn't experienced with anyone in years. It was as if Salim had tapped into a part of her that had lain dormant, a need for companionship and understanding. Their conversations grew deeper, and she confided in him, sharing her frustrations and the loneliness she experienced in her marriage. Salim, empathetic and non-judgmental, became her confidant. For Fatima, he was more than just a friend. He was someone who made her feel valued, heard, and understood. She was drawn to him, and despite her initial resistance, she found herself developing feelings she couldn't ignore. This emotional connection would ultimately lead her to a place she never anticipated. Gradually, Fatima and Salim's connection deepened, transforming from friendship into an intense, clandestine affair. It began with innocent meetings, shared coffee, a walk around the neighborhood, or a quiet conversation in the park. Fatima felt an exhilarating freedom with Salim, who provided her with the affection and attention she had longed for. Their relationship quickly moved beyond mere companionship. Fatima found herself drawn to Salim's warmth, compassion, and the way he looked at her as if she were the center of his world. She knew the risks, yet her desperation for love and connection overpowered her caution. They found secluded places to meet, careful to avoid prying eyes. Each stolen moment felt like a lifeline to Fatima, but it was also filled with the fear of being discovered. The affair marked a period of internal turmoil for Fatima. While she cherished the time with Salim, guilt gnawed at her conscience. She felt torn between her duty as a wife and her desire for happiness. She convinced herself that she deserved this affection, that the void Omar left justified her choices. But deep down, she knew that each secret meeting took her further from the life she had once upheld. She was unaware that their forbidden love would soon unravel in the most disastrous way. Upon discovering Fatima's betrayal, Omar was devastated, his heartbreak giving way to a dark fury. Betrayal in his culture, especially one as personal as this, was not only humiliating, but seen as a stain on his honor that had to be removed. The betrayal shattered his perception of his life, his marriage, and his self-worth. Omar's thoughts grew darker and more obsessive, each moment of anger intensifying his sense of wounded pride. Initially, he questioned whether he should confront Fatima directly, try to rebuild their life, or simply dissolve the marriage. But each option left him feeling unsatisfied, still simmering with anger over the trust that had been shattered. Fueled by a mounting desire for revenge, Omar resolved to make Fatima and her lover pay, planning each step with cold precision. To ensure he had proof that no one could deny, he began secretly gathering evidence. He accessed Fatima's phone, saved their messages, and even managed to get security footage of her leaving Salim's apartment. The more evidence he gathered, the stronger his resolve to punish them both. Driven by his feelings of betrayal and societal expectations around honor, he decided that nothing short of death could restore his pride and sense of justice. Omar devised a plan to lure Salim into a trap, ensuring that he alone would have the power to exact vengeance. Omar orchestrated a meeting, convincing Fatima to lure Salim to a remote, secluded location by fabricating a story that would persuade Salim to attend without suspecting a trap. Fatima, racked with guilt and fear of what Omar might do, reluctantly followed his instructions, too terrified to resist. She knew the situation was spiraling out of control, but felt powerless to intervene or confess to anyone. When Salim arrived at the appointed location, a desolate stretch on the outskirts of Riyadh, he saw Omar waiting. Realizing he'd been deceived, Salim tried to leave, but Omar blocked his path. Omar's fury, controlled and terrifying, quickly escalated as he unleashed his anger and pain through a barrage of insults and accusations. Salim, though stunned, tried to explain himself, pleading for forgiveness. But Omar's anger only grew, and the confrontation took a violent turn. The argument turned physical as Omar attacked Salim in a fit of rage, losing control and leaving Salim mortally wounded. Fatima, who had been waiting nearby, heard the violence unfold, but was frozen by fear and guilt, knowing she'd contributed to the events that led to this point. Salim, her lover, was now dead, and her life with Omar irreversibly broken. The brutal encounter ended with Omar standing over Salim's lifeless body, consumed by an overwhelming mixture of anger and emptiness. His act of revenge had been completed, but the satisfaction he sought had been replaced with a haunting emptiness. As the reality of his actions set in, he realized he could never erase the stain left on his life. Fatima, now even more terrified of her husband, watched as the weight of the situation began to crush her. Omar had thought he could avoid the consequences of his actions. After the confrontation with Salim, he returned to his home with a sense of cold satisfaction. The weight of his anger had been vented, and he had punished the man who had betrayed him, or so he thought. In his mind, this was a justice that would restore his honor, no matter the cost. But what Omar didn't foresee was that the very plan he had put into motion would inevitably ensnare him. While Omar believed he had covered his tracks, he had overlooked key details that would soon unravel the facade he had worked so hard to build. Fatima, overwhelmed by guilt and fear, could not stay silent. She was deeply shaken by the brutality she had witnessed, her mind tormented by the consequences of her actions. The weight of her involvement, both in the affair and in the events leading up to Salim's death, became unbearable. Fearful of what might happen to her, she made a painful decision. Fatima contacted the authorities. With a trembling voice, she informed them of the crime she had witnessed. Her call was a mixture of guilt, fear, and desperation. She couldn't live with herself anymore, knowing she had been complicit in the death of a man who had meant so much to her. But the authorities weren't just interested in Salim's murder. They wanted the full story, and Fatima, consumed by a mixture of remorse and self-preservation, told them everything. She revealed the affair with Salim, the emotional and psychological toll her marriage with Omar had taken on her, and how Omar had planned and executed the confrontation that ended in murder. At first, Omar did not suspect that Fatima had involved the authorities. He believed his secret was safe, that the pain and guilt she felt would keep her silent. But his sense of control began to slip when the police started investigating the case more deeply. They uncovered the evidence he had carefully gathered: photographs, phone records, and messages. Fatima had never been able to completely destroy the incriminating material Omar had amassed to prove her infidelity. The security footage of her visiting Salim's apartment, the texts she had exchanged with him, and even some of their more intimate moments had been kept hidden in Omar's private stash. He had hoped this evidence would serve as his justification, but now it was the very thing that would ensure his downfall. As the investigation continued, the evidence against Omar grew overwhelming. The police soon discovered that the confrontation between him and Salim had been no random act of violence, but a planned attack. Eyewitnesses came forward, recounting seeing Omar leave the scene covered in blood, his demeanor unshaken. Some even reported hearing Omar shout at Salim moments before the fatal blows. The authorities began piecing together a damning case against him, one that would leave little room for escape. The trap that Omar had set for Salim, believing he could enact revenge without consequence, had ensnared him in a far more severe situation. Fatima's testimony was critical, and while Omar had thought her love and fear would keep her from betraying him, her own conscience had forced her to act. Now, both of them stood at the precipice of a terrifying future. The days following the arrest of Omar and Fatima were filled with shock, disbelief, and an overwhelming sense of grief. The scandal shook the very core of the community in Riyadh, where traditional values surrounding family and honor are deeply ingrained. The case became a media sensation, as the public was drawn into the tragedy of a marriage ruined by betrayal, violence, and secrets. The affair between Fatima and Salim had been a private matter until it became the catalyst for murder. The court proceedings were swift and brutal, with the evidence mounting against Omar. The prosecution portrayed him as a cold, calculating man who had plotted the murder of Salim in a moment of intense jealousy and rage. The prosecution also made it clear that Omar had no intention of letting his wife go free from the consequences of her actions. Fatima, in their view, was complicit in the affair and had aided and abetted in the events leading to Salim's death by luring him into the trap. Despite her deep remorse and her role as the victim of both betrayal and violence, the court saw her actions as those of a willing accomplice. The trial became a spectacle in itself, a moral and legal battle between the ideas of justice and revenge, love and betrayal, and honor and punishment. Omar's defense team argued that he had acted out of a deep sense of personal betrayal, citing cultural norms of honor and loyalty as mitigating factors. They insisted that Omar had snapped in a moment of uncontrollable rage, and that the murder of Salim was not premeditated, but a tragic outburst of emotion. His defense tried to paint him as a man who had lost everything: his marriage, his trust, and his dignity. They pleaded for leniency, appealing to the court's sense of mercy. But the evidence was irrefutable. The trail of messages, the video footage, the testimonies, all pointed to the fact that Omar had intentionally sought out revenge. He had carefully planned the confrontation and had executed it with ruthless precision. There was no escaping the cold reality of what he had done. The court, steeped in the laws of Saudi Arabia, had little room for leniency when it came to honor-related crimes. In the end, Omar was sentenced to death. The charge was murder, and while his emotional state might have been considered, the law could not look away from the violent outcome of his actions. Fatima, on the other hand, faced a less severe but still grim sentence. Adultery, especially in the context of a married woman, carried a harsh penalty in Saudi Arabia. Fatima was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, though she would not face the same ultimate punishment as Omar. She was also subjected to corporal punishment, a humiliating and painful reminder of the moral and social costs of her affair. But what broke Fatima the most was not the physical punishment, nor the prison sentence. It was the loss of everything she had ever known. Her marriage to Omar, once a symbol of love, had become a nightmare, and now she would live with the consequences of her choices for the rest of her life. The affair with Salim, which had seemed like a fleeting escape from the emptiness of her marriage, had led to irreversible consequences. The shame of her actions would follow her, and the relationships she had once valued, both with Omar and Salim, were now irreparably destroyed. The story of Omar, Fatima, and Salim is a tragic tale of love, betrayal, revenge, and the devastating consequences of unchecked emotions. It is a story that demonstrates how deeply cultural values, societal expectations, and personal vulnerabilities can impact lives, pushing individuals toward extreme actions with irreversible consequences. For Omar, his quest for vengeance ended in ruin. His sense of honor and justice was ultimately proven to be a hollow pursuit. The very culture that shaped his identity and dictated his sense of pride also led to his destruction. By seeking revenge, he not only killed another man, but also destroyed his own life in the process. His pursuit of justice left him with nothing but an empty victory, one that would cost him his freedom, his dignity, and his future. Fatima's journey was no less tragic. Seeking love and comfort outside her marriage, she had fallen into the arms of another man, only to find herself trapped in a cycle of guilt and fear. Her affair with Salim, though driven by unmet emotional needs, became a catalyst for tragedy, not just for her, but for everyone involved. The affair, once a fleeting escape from her unhappy marriage, spiraled into a nightmare that she could never escape. The loss of her freedom and the torment of living with her choices was the price she paid. Salim's death, the result of a violent and senseless confrontation, was a devastating blow to everyone involved. For him, the affair had seemed like an opportunity for happiness and love, but it ended tragically. His life was cut short, leaving behind a family and a future that would never come to be. Ultimately, this is a story about the cost of secrecy, the perils of revenge, and the devastating toll of emotional neglect. It serves as a poignant reminder that the consequences of actions driven by rage, jealousy, and pride can ripple outward and destroy lives in ways that are irreversible. It is a sobering reflection on how deeply personal choices, especially when made in the heat of emotion, can shape not just the lives of those directly involved, but entire families, communities, and even a society at large. The lessons learned from the tragedy of Omar, Fatima, and Salim should remind us all of the fragile nature of love, the dangers of harboring resentment, and the importance of addressing conflict with honesty, communication, and empathy.